They hanged her on the tree for being half-blood, until the rancher cut the rope, whispered, "You belong here, the Hollow Land." What would you do if you found someone left to die, not by accident, but by design? You cut them down, knowing it might cost you everything. Would you look into eyes that had already seen death and choose mercy over safety? Or would you walk away telling yourself it wasn't your burden to carry? Because in the hollow lands of Bitter Creek, choices like that don't come easy. They come with rope burns and rifle shots. They come with names you can't forget and faces that haunt your sleep. And sometimes they come with a girl hanging from a cottonwood tree left to rot under a sign that reads "Half-Blood Murderer, Bitter Creek, New Mexico Territory, late spring 1873. The land here was hollow, not empty hollow. The difference mattered. Empty meant absent, waiting to be filled. Hollow meant something had been carved out, scraped clean, and left to echo. Wind moved without pause, carrying dust and silence in equal measure. The sun hung high and merciless, pouring its heat over cracked earth thorn brush and the skeletal remains of juniper trees that refused to die but had long forgotten how to grow. The air shimmered, bending light, until the horizon became uncertain, a place where sky and desert bled into one another without bothering to ask permission. Silas Mercer rode slow. He was a man built from hard angles and quiet patience, the kind of man who had learned early that words were expensive and silence was free. His horse, a bay gelding named Ash, moved beneath him with the resigned rhythm of an animal who knew better than to hurry. They had been tracking a sorrel mare for the better part of the morning, hoofprints, half lost in brittle soil leading toward a sparse stand of cottonwoods that marked the only water for miles. Silas tugged his hat lower against the glare and dismounted near the tree line. He led Ash by the reins, stepping lightly, eyes sweeping the terrain with the practiced calm of a man who had spent more years alone than not. That was when he heard it, a sound so faint it could have been whined through grass. But it came again, a soft, wet gasp like someone trying to remember how to breathe. He froze. If you love stories where silence speaks louder than words, where mercy costs more than gold, comment 9 below. And subscribe, because every week we bring you tales from the edge of the world, where choices define who we are. Silas dropped the reins, unslung his rifle from his back, and moved toward the sound with slow, measured steps. Between the trees, the shadows deepened. Birds had gone quiet. The air felt strange, heavier, like the moments before a storm breaks. Then he saw her. She hung by her wrists from the thick branch of an old cottonwood, her arms stretched above her head, body limp and swaying slightly in the wind. A crude wooden sign had been nailed above her letters, burned black into pale wood, half-blood. Murderer. Silas's breath caught. He took one step back, as if the words themselves could strike. The message was not for her. It was for anyone who might pass by, a warning, a declaration, a verdict, already carried out. The girl's skin was sun-dark and streaked with grime. Her long black hair clung to her face in damp ropes. Her dress, what was left of it, was torn, dust-covered, smeared with dried blood. Her legs hung useless feet, barely brushing the dirt. Her chest rose and fell in shallow, stuttering movements. She was alive. Barely. Silas lowered his rifle. "Christ," he muttered, stepping forward. Up close, he could see the burns where the rope bit into her wrists, angry, raw weeping. Her lips were split cheeks hollowed by thirst. One eye was swollen shut. The sharp tang of infection hung in the air like metal and rot. "You hear me, girl?" Silas asked, his voice rough but low. There was no answer. Her head hung like a broken stem. "I ain't here to hurt you." Still no movement, but a sound escaped her, barely more than a whimper. That was enough. Silas reached for his belt, drew his knife. His fingers hovered at the rope, hesitating for the briefest second. That sign still loomed red and jagged like a warning carved in flesh. Then he whispered almost to himself, "Not today." With one clean stroke, the knife sliced through the rope. The girl fell forward. Silas caught her just in time. She collapsed into his arms, light as smoke, burning with fever. Her head lolled against his chest. For a moment she blinked, dazed, unfocused lips moving without sound. Then her fingers clutched weakly at his shirt, and her body went still. Silas crouched down, cradling her with one arm while reaching for his canteen with the other. He poured a few drops onto a scrap of cloth and dabbed at her mouth. "Easy now," he murmured. "You're safe." At least for the moment. The wind stirred the branches above. The sign creaked. He looked up at it again, then at her, and without another word he stood lifting her into his arms. She didn't weigh more than a sack of oats. "You got a name?" he asked, already knowing she wouldn't answer. Silence. "Guess we'll find one." He turned away from the tree, from the sign, from whatever curse they had tried to hang her with. His boots crunched softly over dry leaves as he walked back toward Ash. Behind him, the sign still swung in the wind, but the girl was no longer beneath it. And in the dust where her feet had hung, a single drop of blood fell dark as ink absorbed by the thirsty earth. The stranger's arrival. Silas's ranch, a modest cabin and barn tucked into a dry ravine miles from any town. The land stretched empty in every direction, broken only by sagebrush and rock. The sun dipped low as Silas rode into the hollow, the girl lying sideways in the saddle, unconscious, but breathing. He dismounted and gently lifted her down, cradling her as if she were glass. She weighed nothing less than the guilt he'd carried for years, less than the silence that filled his days. The cabin door creaked open under his boot. Inside, the air was cool and smelled of cedar and dust. A single cot stood near the window. He laid her there carefully, then covered her with a clean wool blanket. She stirred, brow-twitching fingers curled slightly. "Easy," Silas whispered. He lit the oil lamp, its glow flickering against rough wooden walls. The flame danced, casting shadows that stretched and shrank like breathing things. Then he crossed the room, fetched his basin, and poured in water from the jug. He warmed it over the stove, and returned, crouching beside her. Her face was bruised and dry, streaked with sweat and blood. Dirt caked her hairline. The sharp tang of infection hung in the air like metal, and rot, like something dying that refused to give up. Without speaking, Silas dipped a cloth into the water and began to clean her skin, gentle, slow, never rushing. He worked with the care of someone used to mending broken things, and afraid this one might fall apart if he wasn't careful. The cloth came away brown with dust, then pink with diluted blood. He cleaned her wrists last. The raw grooves from the rope were deep, angry red, turning to purple at the edges. He paused. His hand hovered above her arm. The wounds wept clear fluid. Infection was already setting in. If he didn't treat them properly, she'd lose her hands. Or worse. Then, steady as breath, he wrapped the wounds in linen, tied each knot loose but firm. He'd learned this during the war, how to bandage without cutting off blood flow, how to keep a man alive long enough to get him to a surgeon. He'd never expected to use those skills on a girl they'd left to die like a scarecrow in a field. Hours passed. The wind picked up outside, rattling the shutters like skeletal fingers scratching to get in. But inside the cabin it was still. The girl hadn't spoken, not even in sleep. Her breathing came shallow and uneven, interrupted by small gasps that might have been pain or might have been nightmares. Silas sat on the floor by the door, watching the shadows shift across her face. He'd seen men die before. He knew the signs, the way the skin turned gray, the way breathing became a chore instead of a reflex. She wasn't there yet, but she was close. He dozed off sometime near midnight, his back against the door, rifle across his lap. Then she stirred again. Her eyes snapped open, wide, dark, and wild as a cornered wolf. The change was instant. One moment she was unconscious. The next she was coiled like a spring, every muscle taut with panic. Before Silas could speak, her hand shot out, fingers closing around the knife he'd left on the bedside table. The blade flashed silver in the lamplight as she lunged. Silas jerked back, raising his arm to block. The knife grazed his forearm, drawing a thin line of red. He didn't cry out, didn't grab her, just stepped back, hands raised, palms out. Hey now," he said, his voice low and steady. "I ain't them." The girl scrambled to her feet on the cot, back pressed against the wall, knife trembling in her grip. Her breathing came in sharp, ragged gasps, the sound of someone who'd forgotten how to breathe normally, who'd spent too long suffocating. Her eyes darted around the cabin, taking in the door, the window, the walls, like a trapped animal searching for escape. "You're safe here," Silas said again, not moving. "I cut you down. Remember." No response. Just the sound of her breathing and the creak of the wind outside. Her lips moved, but no words came. Her whole body shook from fever, from fear, from something deeper than either. Silas slowly lowered his hands. Blood dripped from his forearm onto the wooden floor, tap, tap, tap. The sound seemed loud in the silence. "I ain't gonna hurt you," he said, "and I ain't gonna stop you if you want to leave." He gestured toward the door. "It's open. You can walk out right now if that's what you want, but it's 30 miles to the nearest town, and they're the ones who strung you up." Her eyes locked on his. For a long moment, neither of them moved. He could see her weighing the choice: trust a stranger who might be lying, or face the desert alone, with infected wounds and no supplies. Then slowly her grip on the knife loosened. Her shoulders sagged like strings being cut. The blade clattered to the floor, a sharp final sound, and she collapsed back onto the cot, curling into herself, shaking so hard the frame rattled. Silas let out a breath he didn't know he'd been holding. He picked up the knife, set it on the far shelf out of reach, and sat down again in the corner, giving her space. His forearm stung, but the cut was shallow. He pressed his sleeve against it to stop the bleeding. "I'm Silas," he said quietly. "This is my land, and you're welcome to stay as long as you need." The girl said nothing, but after a long silence, she reached for the cup of water he'd left on the table. Her hands trembled so badly, water sloshed over the rim, but she drank desperate, gulping swallows that spoke of days without water, of thirst so deep it hurt. Silas watched every movement, not with suspicion, but with the quiet vigilance of someone who knew trust was earned, not given. He'd seen enough broken people to know healing didn't happen in a night. Sometimes it didn't happen at all. She lay back down slowly, cradling the cup against her chest like it was something precious. Her eyes stayed open, fixed on him, watching, waiting, still deciding whether to run. Silas didn't speak again that night. He just watched her drift into sleep. The water half finished in her lap, the linen on her wrists stained faintly red. Her breathing evened out. The trembling slowed, but even in sleep her fingers stayed curled into fists. In the dark, he whispered, mostly to himself, "You're safe here. That's all you need to know." And in the silence that followed, she didn't speak. But she didn't run. Outside, beyond the fence line, a shadow moved. Silas didn't see it, didn't hear it. But if he'd been standing at the window instead of watching the girl, he would have noticed boot prints pressed into the soft earth near the barn, narrow, deliberate circling. Someone had been there, watching the cabin, counting the windows, measuring the distance from the tree line to the door. Someone had been watching, and whoever it was, they hadn't left. The prints led away from the barn, past the well, and disappeared into the darkness beyond the ridge. But they'd be back. People like that always came back. Inside the cabin, Silas checked the bolt on the door one more time, then settled back against the wall. Tomorrow, he'd check the perimeter. Tonight, he'd keep watch. Because in Bitter Creek, safety was never more than an illusion. And illusions, like rope, had a way of breaking when you needed them most. Shelter. The wind blew dry and sharp across the Mercer Ranch, stirring the sand into restless curls that skittered over the hard-packed earth like something alive and searching. It had been over a week since Silas brought the girl back, and the silence between them had grown more settled, like a pact. Neither had spoken aloud, but both understood. But something else had begun to shift in the air, an unease that he could not quite place. A wrongness that lived just beyond the edge of vision. Silas noticed it first in the morning light, a set of footprints too narrow and too fresh to be his. They curved along the edge of the barn, then disappeared behind the well. The soil there was soft, still holding the print, like a memory that refused to fade. He crouched down, studying the tread. Cavalry boots, standard issue, deep impressions. Whoever made them had stood there a long time, watching. Someone had been watching. His blood ran cold. How long had they been there? Minutes, hours. And more importantly, had they seen her? He kept the discovery to himself. But from that day on, he started sleeping with his rifle laid across his lap, propped against the edge of the door. He double-checked the lock every evening, scanned the horizon for signs of movement before letting the horses out to graze. He counted the bullets in his rifle twice a day, checked the windows for sight lines, measured the distance from the cabin to the tree line. Each night he sat on the porch long after the sun dipped below the distant ridges, the lantern at his feet, casting flickering shadows across his boots. He didn't read, didn't whittle, just Saturday listening. The desert had a way of amplifying sound when it wanted to, and swallowing it when it didn't. The girl had not yet stepped outside. She stayed mostly by the window, wrapped in Silas's old coat, watching the world with guarded eyes. She'd started eating more soups, bread-dried meat. Her color was returning. The fever had broken. But she still flinched at sudden sounds, still slept with her back to the wall. Sometimes Silas would catch her staring at the door as if calculating how fast she could run. But that changed one evening, just as the last rays of sun stained the ground blood red, and the air cooled with the coming of night. Without a word, she pushed the door open and stepped barefoot into the yard. Silas looked up sharply from where he sat whittling a piece of driftwood. He said nothing, only watched as she walked slowly across the dust, her feet light and cautious, like she was relearning the weight of the earth beneath her, like she was testing whether the ground would hold her or swallow her whole. In her hand was a long, slender stick, a piece of dried willow from the kindling pile. She knelt in the open space near the barn and began to draw. Silas rose, curiosity prickling at the edge of his caution. He approached carefully, boots crunching softly on gravel, not wanting to disturb whatever had pulled her outside after days of silence. The girl didn't flinch when he stopped a few feet behind her. Her focus stayed on the dirt as the lines took shape, arching curves, pointed wings, a body flaring into flame. The drawing was precise, practiced. This was something she'd done before, many times. It was a bird, mid-flight, wrapped in fire. "What's that, Silas?" asked softly, voice low, like it might spook her. She didn't look up. Her hand continued moving, adding feathers, adding motion. "Firebird," she said, her voice raspy but sure. The silence held for a long beat. Wind stirred the edges of her coat. Somewhere in the distance a coyote called, lonely and sharp. Mama painted this the night they came. Silas crouched beside her, studying the lines. The bird looked alive. Wings spread, mid-beat, beak open, as if crying out, flames streaming from its tail feathers like a comet falling upward. Sayan's hand trembled as she traced the bird's wings one more time, perfecting the curve. "I was hiding in the cedar roots," she continued, voice distant now, like she was somewhere else, seeing something else. "The hollow beneath the old tree. Mama shoved me in there, told me not to move, not to breathe loud, not to cry." She paused, the stick hovering above the dirt. I could hear her still inside the burning tent, still painting. The flames climbed the canvas walls. The soldiers laughed outside, cheered, and through it all she painted. Her voice cracked. The last thing I saw, her silhouette through the smoke, wings spread wide, burning, like the bird she'd drawn on the tent door. She dropped the stick. It fell across the Firebird's wing, breaking the line. "They killed her for being different," Sayan whispered. "For painting birds no one else could see. For teaching me her language. For refusing to forget who we were." Silas didn't move, didn't speak, didn't reach for her. Instead, he slowly lowered himself until his hand pressed flat into the ground, right beside the image of the Firebird. Fingers splayed, palm grounded. The earth was still warm from the day's heat, but underneath it was cool, solid, real. She noticed. The girl looked over, eyes wet now but steady. She'd stopped shaking. It wasn't a gesture of comfort. It was something deeper, a vow. No words needed. No promises made. No hollow reassurances that everything would be all right. Just the weight of his hand in the earth beside her grief, like saying, "I see it. I see you. And I won't look away." And for the first time since Silas had cut her from that tree, the girl let her tears fall. Not out of fear, not out of pain, but because someone had finally stayed. Someone had finally stopped running. They sat like that for a long time, her drawing birds and the dirt hymn keeping watch beside her, the light fading from gold to orange to deep purple. Then a sound cut through the stillness. Hoofbeats. Distant, but closing. Silas's head snapped up. His hand dropped to his rifle fingers, closing around the worn wooden stock. Inside, he said, voice sharp as breaking glass. Now. Sayan scrambled to her feet, the stick falling from her hand. They moved fast back through the cabin door, Silas, bolting it behind them. The iron bar slammed home with a sound like a coffin closing. Through the crack in the shutters he watched. 3 riders crested the ridge silhouettes against the dying Sunday. Too far to make out faces, but the glint of brass buttons was unmistakable. The way they sat in their saddles, straight-backed military, the rifles slung across their backs. Cavalry. Silas's jaw clenched. His finger found the trigger guard of his rifle. Not pulling. Just. Ready. Who are they, Sayan? Whispered her voice, barely audible. She'd pressed herself flat against the wall beside the window, making herself small. Trouble, Silas said. Stay low. Stay quiet. The riders paused on the ridge, surveying the land. One of them, the leader judging by his posture, pointed toward the cabin. They spoke words lost to the wind, and distance, then turned their horses and rode off in the opposite direction, disappearing behind a rocky outcrop to the east. But Silas knew. They weren't leaving. They were circling, checking sightlines, looking for escape routes, counting doors and windows. The same thing he would do if he were planning to take someone by force. He stepped back from the window, his mind racing through possibilities. Fight, run, hide, her each option had a dozen ways to fail. They're looking for someone, he muttered. Sayan's face went pale, the color draining like water through sand. Me. Maybe. Or maybe just passing through. But neither of them believed that. They both knew the truth. Cavalry didn't ride this far from fort or town unless they were hunting, and judging by the way they'd studied his cabin, they'd already found their prey. That night Silas didn't sleep. He sat in the corner, rifle across his knees, eyes fixed on the door. Every creak of wood made his finger tighten on the trigger. Every gust of wind sounded like footsteps. Sayan lay on the cot, curled tight, eyes open, and watching him watch the door. And outside, the wind whispered through the cottonwoods, carrying with it the faint, distant sound of horses. Stamping, waiting, circling, getting closer, trust, and bond. The next morning they came. Silas saw them before they reached the gate, 3 men riding slow and deliberate, brass buttons gleaming in the early light. He stepped out onto the porch, rifle slung casually across his back hat brim shadowing his eyes. The lead rider dismounted. He was tall, sharp-featured, with boots too polished for the land he stood on. A silver badge gleamed on his chest. Lieutenant Garrett James, his voice cut clean through the dry air. U.S. Cavalry. Silas nodded slowly. That's me, Silas Mercer. Garrett reached into his coat, pulled out a folded paper, and handed it over. You're a law-abiding man, I take it. Seen this girl around? Silas unfolded the wanted notice. The sketch was rough, but unmistakable. Dark hair, sharp cheekbones, fire in her eyes, even on paper. Her name printed below, Ayanna. Wanted for murder and escape. Reward, $75. She's considered dangerous, Garrett continued. Killed a settler's wife. Stabbed 2 soldiers on her way out of custody. You'd be doing the country a service if you turned her in. Silas stared at the paper for a long moment. Behind him, inside the cabin, Sayan watched through a crack in the door, her breath held her body frozen. Then Silas refolded the notice carefully and handed it back. Ain't seen no girl around here, he said flatly. Garrett cocked his head. You sure about that? You live out here alone, always have. The lieutenant looked past him toward the cabin. Mind if we take a look around? I do. Garrett raised an eyebrow. Got something to hide? Silas's voice dropped lower. Only my peace. Would like to keep it. For a moment the 2 men held each other's gaze like drawn pistols. Then Garrett gave a tight smile and climbed back onto his horse. Well, if you do see anything unusual, Mercer, we'll be nearby. Real nearby. He turned his horse, but before riding off, he reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a folded poster. He tossed it onto the porch. "In case you change your mind," Garrett said. "That rewards a lot of money for a man living alone." And with that, they rode off, leaving only silence and suspicion behind. Silas waited until the dust swallowed them, then he turned and walked slowly back toward the house. Inside, Sayan stood rigid against the wall, fists clenched. "You lied for me," she whispered. Silas set his hat on the peg. "I did." Why, he looked at her for a long time, searching for the right words. When they came slow. "Because I see you, and I don't see a killer." Her lip trembled just slightly. She looked away, like the weight of being believed was heavier than the rope that once held her. Silas bent down and picked up the poster Garrett had left. He unfolded it slowly. The sketch stared back at him, rough but unmistakable. Dark hair, sharp cheekbones, eyes like embers. Ayana wanted for murder and arson, reward $75. Below the image, smaller text: killed settler's wife, burned homestead, escaped custody, considered armed and dangerous. Silas's jaw tightened. He looked toward Sayan, who stood watching, waiting, terrified. Had he saved her, or had she saved herself by letting him believe a lie? He folded the poster and set it on the table. "Tell me the truth," he said quietly. "All of it." Sayan's hands trembled. She wrapped her arms around herself as if trying to hold her own body together. "My real name is Sayan," she began, voice barely above a whisper. "Not Ayana. They gave me that name when they arrested me. It means eternal bloom. Like I was something pretty they could crush." She took a shuddering breath. "I didn't kill anyone." Silas didn't move, didn't interrupt, just waited. "The settler's wife, her name was Margaret. She was kind to us, used to bring us bread when the soldiers wouldn't let us trade in town. Her husband hated that. Said she was sympathizing with savages." Sayan's voice hardened. "One night he beat her. We could hear it from our camp, the screaming, the breaking. My mother wanted to help, but my brother said no. Said it wasn't our fight." She paused, tears streaming down her cheeks now. "Margaret ran to our camp the next morning, face bloody, begging for help. We hid her in our tent. Her husband came looking, brought soldiers. Said we kidnapped her, forced her. We showed them her bruises. She told them the truth. But they didn't care. We were just," her voice broke, "half-bloods. And that was enough." Silas's fists clenched. "They burned our camp that night," Sayan continued. "Margaret was inside one of the tents when it went up, trapped, screaming. My mother tried to save her. The soldiers shot my mother. Said she was resisting." She wiped her face with the back of her hand. "They hanged Margaret's husband later for what he did to her. But they needed someone to blame for the fire, for her death. So they blamed us. I ran. I stole papers, maps, plans for the railroad they were building through our sacred lands. I was going to expose them, show people what they were doing. But they caught me." Her voice dropped to a whisper. "They said I was a murderer. Said I set the fire. They were going to hang me at dawn, but I escaped." She looked up at Silas, eyes red but fierce. "So, yes, I'm a fugitive. But I'm not a killer." The cabin was silent, except for the sound of her breathing and the wind outside. Silas stood there, the poster still in his hand, staring at the woman in front of him. He had two choices: turn her and collect the reward, go back to his quiet life, or believe her, protect her, and become a fugitive himself. The fire crackled, the wind howled, and Silas Mercer made his choice. He walked to the stove, opened the iron door, and tossed the poster into the flames. It curled, blackened, disappeared. When he turned back to her, his voice was steady. "You're not going anywhere, and neither am I." Threat. That night, they sat side by the fire, the weight of the day settling over them like a heavy blanket woven from exhaustion and unspoken fear. The wind outside hummed low against the walls, a sound that could have been soothing if they didn't know what it might be carrying. But inside the cabin, wrapped in lamplight and shadow, it was quiet, safe, or at least it felt that way. Sayan had wrapped herself in the woven blanket again, her knees drawn to her chest, arms circling them like she was holding herself together. Silas sat nearby, sharpening his knife slowly, the sound of stone against steel, steady and calm, rhythmic, almost meditative. The kind of sound that said, "I'm here, I'm prepared. You're not alone." After a long silence, the kind where words would have felt like intrusions, Sayan shifted. She turned toward him, eyes reflecting the firelight in twin points of amber, and slowly reached out. Her hand trembled slightly, but her movement was deliberate, intentional. First, she placed her hand on her own chest, right over her heart. Her palm pressed, flat fingers splayed. She closed her eyes for a moment, feeling the beat beneath her skin. Then she leaned forward and pressed that same hand to his chest, above the place where his heart beat solid and slow beneath the worn fabric of his shirt. Silas froze. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. The meaning pulsed between them, quiet and fierce. "I am still here. And so are you." His hand rose, not to stop her, not to question, but to cover hers. Fingers entwined, his palm rough with calluses, hers scarred from rope burns. Two hands that had known violence finding gentleness. In the crackling glow of the fire, something shifted. Not a confession, not a vow, not even words. Just understanding. The kind that lives deeper than language, older than promises. And for the first time since the tree, since the fire, since the night her world burned, neither of them felt alone. But peace in places like Bitter Creek never lasted long. The next morning, Silas stepped outside to check on the horses, and froze. The air was wrong, too still, the kind of stillness that comes before storms or violence. On the fence post, nearest the cabin, someone had left a message. A piece of rope, frayed and burned at the ends, hung from a nail driven deep into the wood. The rope was old, weathered, but the nail was new, shiny, placed with care, and beneath it, carved into the wood, with a knife letters deep enough to have taken time, deep enough to be a threat. "We know." Silas's blood ran cold. His breath caught in his throat like a stone swallowed raw. He grabbed his rifle from where it leaned against the porch rail and scanned the horizon, eyes sweeping left to right, looking for movement, for glint of metal, for anything. Nothing moved. The land stretched empty sagebrush and stone and endless sky. But the message was clear. They were being watched. And whoever was watching had been close. Very close. Close enough to hammer a nail. Close enough to carve letters. Close enough to leave a piece of rope that looked exactly like the one that had held Sayan to that tree. It was a promise. He turned and walked back, inside, jaw-tight rifle gripped so hard his knuckles went white. Sayan looked up from where she sat, mending a torn shirt needle, frozen mid-stitch thread trailing. She saw his face and stood, the shirt falling forgotten to the floor. "What is it? They know you're here," Silas said, voice flat. Controlled. The kind of control that barely held back fury. "And they're coming back." Her face went pale, the color draining so fast it looked like someone had opened a vein. "When soon? Maybe tonight. Maybe tomorrow. But soon." Silas paced the small cabin, mind racing through calculations. How many men, how many rifles could they hold the cabin, for how long? And what happened when the bullets ran out? "We can't stay," he said, finally stopping mid-stride. "We have to run." Where? Her voice was steady, but her hands shook. "South, over the border, Mexico. There's land where no one knows your name, where they won't look at your skin like it's a crime." He turned to face her. "I know people, quiet people. We can disappear." Sayan nodded, slowly processing. "When do we leave tonight?" "Before the moon rises. They'll expect us to wait until dawn, so we don't." She stood straighter, determination hardening her features like clay baking in a kiln. "Then we pack." They worked in silence, gathering supplies, rolling blankets, tight-filling canteens until water sloshed. Silas saddled the horses, while Sayan gathered food, jerky, hardtack, dried beans, anything that would keep. Every sound made them jump. Every shadow looked like a threat. Every creak of wood sounded like footsteps on the porch. Silas checked his ammunition twice, loaded both rifles, made sure his knife was sharp, tied down anything that might rattle or clang. They couldn't afford noise. couldn't afford mistakes. As the sun began to set, painting the desert gold and crimson like the world was on fire, Sayan stepped outside one last time. She knelt in the dirt where she had drawn the Firebird days before. The image was still there. Faint but visible wings spread, body aflame. She traced the outline again with her finger, following the curves she'd drawn from memory, from grief, from hope. Then she whispered something in a language Silas didn't know. The words were soft, musical, ancient. A blessing, a farewell, a promise. She pressed her palm flat into the center of the Firebird, like she was pushing something into the earth, leaving it behind, or taking it with her. When she stood, Silas was waiting by the horses, reins in hand. "Ready?" he asked. She looked back at the cabin once, at the place that had been her sanctuary, her prison, her healing. Then she turned forward. "Ready?" They mounted up and rode into the growing darkness, not as fugitives, but as two souls who refused to let the world define them. Behind them, the cabin door swung shut in the wind, creaking on its hinges. The Firebird in the dirt glowed faintly, and the last rays of sun wings spread wide, ready to fly, or ready to burn. And somewhere in the hills, Lieutenant Garrett lowered his spyglass and smiled. He'd been watching from the ridge since dawn. Watched them panic. Watched them pack. Watched them run. "Let them run," he murmured to the man beside him, a tracker, narrow-faced and grinning. "We'll hunt better prey that way." He folded the spyglass with a sharp click. "Give them an hour, then we follow." The tracker nodded. "And when we catch them," Garrett's smile widened, cold as January. "The girl hangs. The man watches. Then he hangs too." He mounted his horse, leather creaking. "Justice," he said, "always catches up." But he didn't know what Silas Mercer had learned in the war. Sometimes the prey bites back. Defiance. The moon was high, full, and pale, as bone, casting silver light over the scrub brush and stone ridges that marked the edge of the known land. Only a few more miles, and they would be across the border, free, unseen, forgotten by those who wished them buried. Silas's breath came in low, steady rhythm, eyes sweeping the trail ahead, body tense in the saddle. Sayan rode beside him, her fingers tight around the reins, the red thread from her mother's shawl fluttering at her neck. The night was silent, except for the sound of hooves on stone. Then came the shot. A crack through the silence, sharp, merciless. Silas jerked back in the saddle. Blood bloomed across his shirt like a crimson star. Silas Sayan screamed, pulling hard on her horse's reins as he slumped sideways. He hit the ground hard, groaning, clutching his side. Another shot whizzed overhead, striking the rock behind them. Sayan dropped to the ground, dragging Silas toward a nearby cut in the rock. An old wash eroded into a narrow crevice. She gritted her teeth against the pain in her shoulders as she hauled him out of the line of fire. The rock scraped her knees. His weight dragged heavy across the gravel. Blood soaked through his fingers. He looked up at her, eyes glassy. "You were tied to a tree once," he rasped, "because of men like them. I won't let you be left behind. Not again." Sayan pressed both hands to his wound, forcing the bleeding to slow. Her voice was steel. "Then don't die. We live together, or we fight together." She pulled his rifle from the scabbard, checked the chamber, and peeked through the gap in the rocks. Two cavalrymen were dismounting, moving slow through the brush. Too confident, too sure. Sayan set her jaw. She waited until one stepped clear into the moonlight, then fired. The shot hit his leg. He screamed and dropped. The other ducked for cover. She fired again, this time wide, to make them think more were waiting. The soldiers retreated, dragging their wounded companion with them. Their shouts faded into the distance. Sayan didn't breathe until the hoofbeats were gone. She turned back to Silas, who was barely conscious. "Stay with me," she whispered, kissing his forehead. "We're almost there." And somehow, through pain and blood and the cold desert night, they made it. Belonging. By dawn, they had crossed the border. By nightfall, they found a clearing near a river bend deep in the pines where no patrols rode and no maps reached. Weeks passed. The wound healed slow. Silas walked with a limp now, but he lived. He trained horses again, though never let Sayan out of his sight for long. And in a small house, built of pine and patience, Sayan Mercer sat by a window stitching a tiny shirt, no longer than her forearm. Her belly had rounded gently beneath her apron. Her hands moved slow, steady. Outside, Silas called softly to a young Mustang guiding it around the corral. His voice was calm, his eyes always finding her silhouette behind the curtain. The past hadn't vanished, but here it no longer hunted them. Inside